One, right? So housing advocates try to alleviate the crisis through what's called the 3 Ps. That's production, building more housing, preservation, preserving existing affordable housing, and protection. Sorry, looking at my notes. And protection means keeping people in place as much as possible. So we're discussing community land trusts today because they utilize all of these Ps in addition to a 4th P that housing justice advocates normally add, which is power building, right? So we're not just working on the housing crisis itself, we're working on building power in communities that are often made to be powerless, right? And this is an important intervention, and it impacts all facets of life, right? When people live in these CLT communities. So what I want to do before I introduce our guest today is just talk a little bit about what a CLT is. I'm going to put this link in the chat from the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which one of our guests is, that's their home organization. And it just has a little bit of information about what a CLT is. But the basic model, the CLT is an organization, a nonprofit that owns land and leases land, right? So if you are buying a house from a CLT, you're buying the house, the structure, and it's divorced from the land. The CLT is leasing you the land on a long-term lease. It's usually 99 years. That keeps prices affordable. You're also agreeing as a buyer that if you were to sell the house, you would sell it at an affordable price. And that makes sure that the house is affordable for generations to come. And this can happen with housing, but also lots of different other things. It can happen with apartment buildings. It can happen with farmland. It can happen with small businesses. There are lots of different things that fit into this model. So I'm very excited today to have 2 speakers with us to talk about how community land trusts work in their region, and also what philanthropy and donors can do to support community land trusts, because this is a huge opportunity for philanthropy and donors to make a big impact on this issue. So first, we have Minnie McMahon, an organizer, gardener, lover of community. She is the program director for the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network, which is hosted by the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. She started at DSNI in 2019, first acting as the project and operations manager at Dudley Neighbors Inc., and then the Community Land Trust. And before that, she worked for small farms in Massachusetts, California, and New York. So we're very excited to have Minnie with us today. I'm also excited to introduce Geraldine Gacau, Program Manager for Community Ownership and Community Power Fund, which is housed at Common Council. Geraldine has worked in philanthropy. Geraldine works in philanthropy and applies her lived experience and 12 plus years of professional experience in public service, organizing, and intersectional policy advocacy across social justice issues. She's passionate about pushing for economic and housing justice solutions that not only shift our systems, but reimagine them altogether. And I was very, very lucky to work closely with Geraldine at the Liberty Hill Foundation, so I'm happy she is here today. All right, that's enough of the front matter. We're going to dive into this conversation. So I have a bunch of questions for us today. Then once we're done with our panel discussion, we're going to move into breakout rooms so that everyone has a chance to kind of process the information a little bit. If you have any questions, put them in the chat while we're talking, and I'll try to bring them up as I can, but no guarantees we'll get to everything because we are, as always, short on time. So I'm going to ask the first question for both of our speakers. How does the work you do with community land trust intervene in your respective housing markets? We have 2 very high stress housing markets, Boston and California. What is the impact for people living in CLT units? So Geraldine, how about we start with you and then go to Minnie?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Jessa. Hello, everybody. Also, thank you so much for joining. Really happy to be here. Yeah, so I guess I just first wanted to mention, just maybe start off with some context, share a little bit more about the work that I do, and then kind of try to thread the needle back to more directly answer your question, Jessa. But I think that you're right. I just really wanted to reiterate that what you just said, which is around California being having one of the most impacted and pressured housing markets in the country, right? It's often seen as pretty progressive, but organizers and communities are still fighting tooth and nail for what they need and when it comes to their housing. And the unhoused issue, of course, is out of control in the state and has been for a very long time. And now and for the past how many years, in addition to communities and tenants fighting for the protections that they need in order to survive today, it's also pretty clear that they really want to create the future that they want to live in as well. And so that's really where the CLT model and other forms of community ownership models come in to really build that and start to practice that and see what they could do. Because I think it's clear and very obvious that the current set of like maybe normative tools is not enough, right? Or it's not they aren't the only solution. So this is a way for folks to really express and practice that creativity and understanding what other solutions might be out there. And at the moment in California, there are actually 50 CLTs across the state, which is extremely exciting. And even within that, that's grown exponentially in the last, I would say, 20 years, even more so in the last 5 to 10. I even think that this number earlier this year was like in the low 40s. So it tells you a little bit about like the growing interest that people have for this kind of solution as it being one of the portfolio, right, of in housing solutions. And the work that I do at Common Council Foundation really falls squarely into that. And so, like Jessa mentioned, I help to manage a philanthropic pool fund called the Community Ownership for Community Power Fund. And really, at its just, its larger mission is to really try to expand the community ownership movement across the state at large. Really centering organizations that are BIPOC led and committed to organizing and power building. It was also just to kind of even note, because I think it'll be sprinkled around in what I say today a little bit, but it was pretty intentional from the beginning that when COCP was launched in 2022, that, there will be a support of CLTs, but that we really wanted to kind of provide broader support to organizations, that are exploring the community ownership models in housing and land in different ways, just to be able to support and kind of give more understanding to the nuances that and the ways that different different communities build power, right? Because not every no community is the same, right? So I just wanted to note that. And in terms of like how we try to accomplish that, it's really been to try to achieve two goals. The first, and also like in that address two of the biggest challenges that we've been hearing from our partners on the ground time and time again. And so the first one is, when it comes to, a lot of our partners have said, hey, we really need additional funding and resources to grow our organizational capacity, right? A lot of organizations and CLTs are very small. They're very emerging. Again, these are folks from the ground that are just trying to explore this work and they know that there's a problem and they're trying to fix it. And so we center our grant making approach around that to do capacity building general operating grants to CLTs. And at the moment, we've given grants to, I think, about 28 organizations statewide, CLTs, as well as other organizations as well, CDCs, et cetera. And then we're working with, at the moment, we've been convening 14 CLTs and CDCs for the past, at this point, 2 years to co-design, and then at the end of next year, hopefully launch an integrated capital fund, which will hopefully provide a new innovative source of funding for organizations in California that are trying to acquire land and housing. And when it's launched, it'll be the first of its kind in the state. So we're super excited about it. And what will be unique is that it'll also be what's also core to it is that it'll have a community governance component element as well. And so coming back around to this question, I mean, when we think about like how we're intervening in the model, it's really around that, right? How are we really supporting organizations on the ground that are following or creating community-led efforts to reclaim land and housing, period, right? For long-term affordability and preservation. how are we, how are we building the capacity of CLTs to address the crisis and advance different solutions in order to, in a way that they feel is best and particular to the communities that they live in. And then I would say the last couple things I would say as well, and Minnie, I'll give you the floor because I feel like I just talked a lot, is as an intermediary foundation, how can COCP and then also a Common Council Foundation really use our platform as a way for communities of color to leverage philanthropy, right, in order to support those grassroots efforts toward self-determination and housing justice. Rather than the other way around, how can we really utilize and think about philanthropy as being one of those tools? And then once that integrated capital fund that we're trying to co-design is built and launched, how can we also use that as a way to intervene the housing financial industry, which in itself is like a whole other beast. I'm learning more and more every day, right? To try to provide a new kind of a way to capitalize the development that we want to see. So yeah, so I will stop there and I'll pass it to you, Minnie.
Thanks, Sherilyn and Jessa and Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see some familiar names. Yeah, I appreciate the question around sort of CLTs intervening in our housing markets and the impact. And I think briefly the model is really about the decommodification of land and housing. So there's a sort of socio-political economic intervention, like, wait a minute, we should be separating, or let's think about separating, or let's practice and find out some of the impacts of separating land and housing from like a purely transactional economic like tool. And that's what CLTs have been doing, since they were conceived of 50 years ago, and are drawing on a very long history across many cultures and many experiments and many norms, not just experiments, of sort of doing economics in a way that is not the capitalism that we've been living with in sort of an extreme way in the last 30, 40, 50 years. So moving away from private wealth accumulation through land and housing at the expense of others, right? So CLTs do allow for wealth generation. They are a way to have stable housing that is affordable, that is, you don't have a really high mortgage, you don't have a huge down payment, and you're guaranteed your home and you're building equity in it. So the equity piece is really important, but it's moving away from the home as the source of private wealth accumulation that is then hurting your neighbor, right? Or contributing to an economy that actually relies on some of us having and some of us not having. And then another piece is just wanting to really, that's not the only way we conceive of home, right? Even in our intensely capitalist society, we understand that we want to live in our homes. We want to have safe homes. We want access to our homes, to homes of our own, and wanting to lift that up too, like values, homes are places to live and be and host and be safe and like be an anchor for us to thrive. And wanting to bring that use, which is not a radical use, which is not a new use, back into like the frame, back into the light. I'll just say, of our roughly seven member community land trust, the Greater Boston CLT network, we do new construction of housing that will be permanently affordable. We also do acquisition. So we have the CLTs being the we. So we have community land trusts that are buying homes from the market and then bringing them under their stewardship and governance and ownership in order to permanently preserve their affordability. So in this period of intense speculation and the gentrification and the displacement that come with it, the ability to actually purchase these physical assets and have the families in them be able to stay is hugely impactful for the individual and for their local communities, and then for sort of geographically the community at large when you're thinking about, well, what good communities are sites of investment and where outside, investors can come in to try to buy, to have a stock of housing that is not up for sale, and that is actually for people is powerful. And I'll just say, I think one other sort of thing about intervention that I feel we're making progress on, while it's an extremely uphill battle and there's also a lot of pushback, is at the state level, at the city, different municipalities, getting more public investment in this type of housing, in permanently affordable housing, is something we're seeing some movement on. And that's really exciting. So, and like Geraldine spoke to, getting more philanthropic investment, grants from private individuals or for philanthropies, getting more capital into this model and in this practice and into this way, and also getting more like policies and programs that facilitate those of us who are working on the sort of practical, visible decommodification of land and housing.
Thank you both. We're absolutely going to talk more about the finance aspects, but before we get there, I want to go back to something you both mentioned, which is the power building aspect, this kind of intangible thing where housing isn't just a place to live, but it's a place to thrive. And very early in my housing career, I had an organizer come to me and say, people are being displaced faster than I can organize. That means I can't build political power. So I want to hear from both of you, how can community land trust build community power, and why is it important? And whoever has an idea at the tip of their tongues can go first.
Do you want to jump in, Minnie?
Sure. This is definitely not all of my thoughts on this, but one thing that comes to mind is, locally within our network, the community land trusts are, we don't think of ourselves as housing organizations. Yes, the vast majority of what we're doing is building, preserving, stewarding, co-governing housing, but the origins of all of our CLTs is community organizing, and many of our CLTs came out of existing organizations, cultural institutions that were already doing power building work in their communities, and then seeing, oh, wait a minute, how can we actually control land and housing and other community assets, open space? So the community land trust movement is vast. And you will find CLTs that are very much like the local affordable housing provider. And they're offering something really important, but they're not necessarily doing the sort of that power building work around defending communities against gentrification and displacement. And I think in addition to sort of like the defense mode, we're also trying to build something here together. How are we relying on each other to make plans for our own communities? So rather than the city or outside developers coming in and saying, we're going to overlay this master plan onto your community and invite you to a couple meetings, having our communities be deeply involved in and at times creating their own community plans. So it's not just about what happens on our CLT land on these parcels here, but what's happening across our geographic communities, and what is our voice in this. It's not just the land and the housing. So those are some thoughts that come to mind. And one more piece is the governance. I think so many of us, this is me. I think that so many of us are not taught about our own power, our own ability to dream, to vision, and to execute, and to do that together. And I think that's something that community land trusts do not necessarily do, but there's a tremendous potential, and they do more at the power building ones that are like, hey, we're in this together, and how are we governing together? So that's another important aspect, is the governance and the sort of self and community empowerment.
Anything to add, Geraldine?
Yeah, I mean, I really love this question and I really appreciate what you said, Minnie. I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. And to kind of like circle back and maybe add to what you already said, I mean, I think that, yeah, a core element of the CLT model is really about putting land and housing into the ownership and stewardship of the hands of of community members rather than corporations or market forces, right? It's really trying to not just like sort of flip the way that sort of decisions and money flow and our decisions get made within our housing industry, but really trying to reshape what that even looks like. And folks do that via organizing. I think it's also a really great point, Minnie, that you mentioned around the fact that, yeah, all CLTs in their own way play an extremely important part in the ecosystem when we think about making sure that people are housed, period. And how are we making sure that we are utilizing, again, this tool as a way to build community power? And that's, I think, at its core, what makes it so unique and different to traditional affordable housing development. There is a very clear intention for many CLTs to make sure that organizing is infused in the model throughout, right? Making sure that, we're keeping people housed who would otherwise be evicted or priced out. Or also made me think, going back to something that you mentioned in the first question, Minnie, like challenging that notion of private ownership and instead opening those spaces for community stewardship, right? And I feel like you can't do that without the like really thinking about what it means to put decision making and agency and self-determination in the hands of like community, right? I mean, should also name that, at least in the US, the model was even born out of the civil rights movement, right? In the late 60s. And so when we think about how this model was really, developed in the country and really set a model for other ways that we live, work, interact with each other. This is something that really, like you said, Minnie, provides an opportunity to do just that and decenters the individual and like redistributes that concentrated power. Um, I guess something that I'll also name, just because I feel like a lot of the power building is through like collectivity and relationships. We see so much of that happening and flourishing in different ways across the state. We see CLTs also developing like networks, right? We see CLTs like building connection, that social capital that's really important. I'll name that a lot of CLTs tend to be, like I mentioned earlier, on the emerging or smaller side. And so there's a lot of intention around cooperation rather than competition in order to build that collective power. I remember speaking to someone from a CLT based in LA, where I'm based, and I remember them telling me, yeah, there's not one day that goes by where I don't pick up the phone and call someone from another CLT within the network in LA. And I think that that really speaks volumes and tells you a little bit about like, right, like what it means to collaborate, what it means to think about what collectivity really looks like on the ground for residents, but also like in for the CLT organizations themselves. So yeah, I just wanted to name that too.
Thank you, Geraldine. I encourage anyone who wants to learn more about New Communities, which is the collective of Black farmers in Georgia that Geraldine was mentioning. There's a link on the DSNI page that I shared earlier. And we also have another link in the chat of cltroots.org. There's such a rich history in this tradition of cooperation and collective power. We could talk about it for days. So I encourage everyone to share resources. My next question, which is almost not the flip side, but the challenges, right? So we know that CLTs are an important intervention. We know that CLTs can be used as a tool to build community power. So it's not just about the affordable housing, it's about building relationships and influence. But there are challenges too, right? Everyone always talks about scale. CLTs are difficult to scale. People often talk about generational wealth. They say you're removing this opportunity. Minnie, you touched on this earlier. I'm curious how both of you respond to these challenges and other kind of common arguments you hear against CLTs. And Minnie, maybe let's go with you first, since you talked about the generational wealth piece earlier, and then we'll go to Geraldine.
Sure. Well, these are two very big questions, scale and wealth. So that are related for sure. But I think that well, CLTs do not remove opportunities to create generational wealth, and CLTs are not zero equity propositions. So that's just to be very clear about that, because there are legitimate concerns and criticisms about this model. But, you know, wanting to be clear about those terms. So there is a built-in, there's built-in equity appreciation in CLT home ownership. So something you know as a CLT homeowner is that your home will appreciate in value, and it'll appreciate in a way that you can anticipate on the day that you buy your home. So you are agreeing to limit your equity to a certain amount. So in a hot market, your home is not going to be worth what your neighbor's home might be. So that's clear. And we're not trying to say it's the same thing as having free, like, yeah, you can't sell your house for $1 million. So that does limits your equity. And CLTs are providing a stable home in which you can better project and plan for your costs and the equity appreciation over time, because while we're in a very hot market, things also change. And sometimes it's hard to even imagine right now, but homes do devalue. And so just wanting to be clear about that. And we're not trying to be primarily wealth generators as CLTs. And like the private accumulation of wealth through your home is not a primary goal of CLTs. And people's financial well-being is really important. So yes, the fact that by being a homeowner with an affordable down payment, with an affordable mortgage, with an affordable purchase price, it's essentially, it's like rent, it's rent control. Your mortgage payment it's predictable, it's yours every time you make a payment. That's equity coming back to you. So we do look out for the individual wealth of CLT homeowners, but yeah, it's a different proposition than just like free market. And then there are certain arguments that, the like CLTs as like a return on investment percentage wise are quite stable and like, oftentimes higher than government bond returns or putting your money in CDs or whatever. So there's an ask that folks who are highly critical of the model in terms of financial gain also look at sort of like historically typical returns in the ways that we invest, and like how do CLTs stack up. And they're actually not so bad. In fact, they can be quite good. And a majority of shared equity homes across the country, this isn't just CLTs, but including CLTs, you actually find that the majority of CLT homeowners end up moving on to purchase a market, a non-income restricted or equity shared equity home down the line, which suggests that people are finding themselves in a better economic position. So, coming through CLT homeownership. So that's like a piece of it. So just it is important to use sort of traditional market indicators of wealth and financial accrual. And that's a little bit of a response to that. And we're also really concerned with community-wide health and wealth, and what is the profile of a community? How much displacement is there? What are the home ownership rates? What is the cost burden? Because we know so many homeowners too are cost burdened. And how is it shaping up on a community economics level? So it's not just about whether I have money, it's about what's our community looking like. And really wanting to invest in housing and land ownership and stewardship as, non-extractive. I wonder if I should, I think I should pass to Geraldine, but if maybe we can come back to the scale question, or maybe Geraldine will speak to.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do generational wealth and I could pivot to scale, then pass it back to you, Minnie, if you want to engage with it. Because we should talk about that for sure. Yeah, no, I love what you said. I mean, I guess I want a few other things that I will also mention as it like, I mean, when I think about the generational wealth question, and I'm so glad that we're talking about this today, I'm just kind of like, can we not pretend that we already live in a society where so many people are already excluded from private home ownership and housing? Because we do, and that is totally the case, right? So many people cannot access housing as it is. So we need to figure out ways to be able to provide that for them. And so this model, all it does is it really opens different opportunities for especially lower income folks and communities of color to be able to do that in community with others, right? Where they can't do it on their own, which I think is like so important, and can really is meant to really just complement other models or other housing solutions in the portfolio. It's not meant to be, I don't think it was ever meant to be kind of stated as sort of the silver bullet solution, but this is really a way for people to access to access housing if they weren't already able to do so. The second thing I wanted to mention is that I think it's also really important to think about to some of the things that you mentioned earlier, Minnie, like the notion of or the importance of generational stability as equally important as generational wealth, right? When we think about someone being able to, like you said, like it's a form of rent control. So when we think of someone being able to anticipate and have a stable level of rent or mortgage that they're paying toward their housing that they can plan for, that speaks so many volumes when it comes to a family that's just trying to make it, and needs to figure out their long-term plan for their family to survive. This is a way for even potentially their children to be able to also move into the house. So yes, it does create generational wealth and stability, just in a different way that we're used to thinking of, because we are in a system that really prioritizes and adds merit to private ownership. So I'll name that. And then I think going to the scale question, and I think I saw like a note on time. I didn't get to see it completely, but going to the scale question, yes, it is definitely a question that always comes up. And like, yeah, there are some legitimate critiques or concerns when it comes to the model. What I think I'll say is I think that, yeah, like even though there are challenges when we think of scale, right? Like, I want to name that, this model doesn't have really access to formal avenues of federal funding, for instance, that traditional affordable housing does. People also critique that maybe there isn't a business model out there because so many of the projects are so niche, so that literally limits folks from being able to access like larger pools of housing. I definitely understand all that. And I think, again, CLTs are not a catch-all solution, and I don't think that that was ever trying to be the case. I think sometimes when people are trying to exercise like new innovative solutions in housing, but for other challenges out there, there tends to be sort of like this understanding or expectation that this is like the one thing, but it's not the one thing. This is meant to complement every other thing, right? And I also want to say that I think that we should also be clear about the fact that there isn't one affordable housing option that doesn't have its own challenges of scale, right? Again, which is why it's part of this larger portfolio of different solutions for folks to attain affordable housing. And then the last thing is, and I'll pass it over to you, Minnie, to add, because I remember we talked about something really important that I don't know if you want to mention, but um, the really asking folks and challenging everyone here to really redefine our definition of scale, right? For our community partners in California, a lot of them have made it very clear that it's not always about just vertical growth, it's also horizontal. So how are we, it's just like rather, it's more like a many organizations versus one big one, right? How are we really scaling the geographic footprint in that way? And then how are folks really thinking of scale as in like scale of influence, right? Whether it be via policy or other ways, again, of power building that they're trying to seek and achieve. So is there anything that you wanted to add, Minnie, or Jessa? I see you're coming off mute.
Can
Yeah,
I
sorry.
can I say
Well,
one thing very briefly?
yeah, that's fine.
Which is we're also seeing quite a bit of increased interest in private homeowners, so like standard fee simple homeownership, folks who are wanting to transfer their land and house and potentially houses to CLTs. So CLTs not just as a proposition for folks who simply don't have access to market rate homes, but CLTs as a way to decommodify land and housing across socioeconomic reality as well.
Absolutely. And the question of scale, I think, and what you were mentioning, Minnie, about people who want to kind of put their property into the CLT goes to our last question, which is, what do you need funding for? And what role does philanthropy and donors play in the movement for CLTs?
All right. I'll start us off. We build, so CLTs are organizations, they need operating capital, they need unrestricted grants to operate, to pay for CFOs and back office work, to pay for stipends to support community members who come to governance committee meetings and are part of community planning processes. So programmatic kind of work. You know, we need project money. We're building housing. We're building farms. We're building open spaces, cultural centers, and we need acquisition money as well. And so grants for projects, grants for operations, and then in turn on the investment side, the sort of like expecting a return or a financial return on your investment, we need very low cost and what is called patient capital, which is to say low cost loans that wouldn't be called back for quite a few years. So permanent financing for projects. And yeah, there's so much to say about that, but that's a list of some of the things we need.
Okay. I know we're a little behind, so I'll try to speed this up a little bit. But I mean, I'll just say that, in general, COCP or CCF's approach was really like in terms of how we support our partners on the ground was really shaped and is really shaped by them. And so we really think about how can we really resource and support an ecosystem at large rather than one specific organization? How can we really learn from them and understanding what the gaps are? And I really urge everybody here in their own ways to do that and try to understand and figure that out. I also am a pretty good believer of like there being multiple entry points for people to support in the way that they can. And I understand people who are in this space right now are coming out from all different kinds of vantage points and roles, right? So I do think that there are different ways for folks to do that. In addition to everything that Minnie mentioned, like +1 to all of that, again, I really want to encourage everyone to think about it through filling gaps and through an ecosystem sort of approach. Also really thinking about, how can you resource CLT orgs directly, but then how can you also think about other important partners in the ecosystem without taking away from the direct work, supporting that, like TA support or like integrated capital funds, like the one that COCP is trying to launch next year. And the last couple things I'll just mention is like, it's a long-term commitment, right? These are long-term assets and they need long-term commitments from these organizations on the ground who really need the track record to grow and do all the things that we mentioned today. And then again, being in the philanthropy world, I want to urge folks within our philanthropic folks here to really think about how we shift power. right? How is it that we're shifting decision-making related to how money moves, and then shift our investments? I really look towards justice funders. I want to give them a quick shout out as a way to like even ground some of my own frameworks. They have a just transitions investment framework, and they also run, I'll put the link in the chat too, a just a transition investment academy for folks within foundations that have endowments that are trying to understand and seek how they reinvest dollars from their endowment to other things like CLTs. So I'll name that.
Thank you both. I know this was kind of a rough and tumble panel. We never have enough time to talk about this stuff. It's always important to PDF that our participants have a couple of minutes in breakout rooms at the end of our reframing philanthropy discussions to just talk amongst yourselves. So we're going to split out into breakout rooms for the last 8 to 10 minutes. We might go a little bit over. If you have to go, that's okay. But if you can hang with us, I really encourage you to. We're going to split out into breakout rooms. You'll debrief what you heard today. I encourage you to come up with questions for our panelists. We won't be able to answer them today, but we'll send them to Geraldine and Minnie and then send out answers afterward, if that's okay with you both, just so we can still make sure we're hearing from everyone who is here today. So with that, Laura and Sophia, I'm looking at you for breakout rooms.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to open up the breakout rooms and you'll get moved automatically. Sophia, it's going to send you to a room and we're going to have to exchange. It's just a little glitch in the system. So see you soon. Everybody. Always the interruption about the recording in progress. Welcome back, everybody. I was so excited to be in my small room where we had representation from across the country and lots of different experience levels with CLT. So I just want to give everybody a chance for each of the rooms to share out any things that you're hearing. So Jess, I'm going to turn to you for your room first.
Yeah, we had a great discussion, folks from Massachusetts and California, which was great. We talked a lot about how do we prevent the CLT model from recreating the systemic barriers that already exist. We know that just because there's a process in place, that doesn't mean the process is automatically equal. So really, how do we keep pushing the edge for what we can do to actually make things radically inclusive? We also talked a lot about how, I think, Tom, you're talking about in Waltham, there's a CDC, which is different from a CLT, but how can you kind of pressure that CDC to be accountable to the community? So there's all these different ways of taking the values and ideals of a CLT, and the question is really, how do you put them into practice?
Thank you. Alistair, what did you hear in your room?
A lot of folks that were in the same network, and so it was really nice to kind of hear and be in that space with folks. But really, I think we were talking about how to access dollars for this stuff and the challenges around that. But I'll let other folks chime in.
I was in that group, and I think one of the things that came out for me was that you have to be in networks. You have to make relationships and keep relationships, work on them. And one of those relationships is government. You have to serve in government or have a relationship with your municipal or state government, and there's an opportunity there.
Thank you. And then I was lucky to be in a room with some amazing folks, and including somebody who worked on a CLT that didn't pan out, that failed at the end. So, and is willing to retry it. And then we had Ali, who's like one of the newest staff members for Equity Trust and is working on CLTs. So we've got we had a broad range of experience. And I was excited to hear from two folks from Wilf who were really new to learning about CLTs, but want to bring it to their Women and Investments Committee to talk about how they might use the CLT model. And we talked a little bit about financing and the need to raise money. So I was glad that a lot of our folks are willing to take next steps and have to-do lists. So thank you all for being part of this discussion. I know we just scratched the surface. There was so much wisdom in the room, and glad to have everybody. I wrote down some notes for myself. Just one of the presenters talking about how we're not taught how to dream and imagine together. That really caught my attention, and thinking about how we collaborate. And I just want to talk. I just want to emphasize again one of the presenters who said, it's not always about generational wealth, but generational stability. And just to emphasize it, because I hear that in my community, like, oh, it's the dream of home ownership. We should all own a home. And that is not everybody's pathway. And so this idea of getting people access to housing, so key to our future. So thank you all for being part of the conversation. We will send out a copy of the recording, contacts for our presenters. And I just want to ask my colleague Sophia to just share. We've got a screenshot of our next upcoming Reframing Philanthropy, which will be in February, on February 12th. I always remember that because it's my mom's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. Being from Illinois, you remember Lincoln's birthday. It was a day off growing up. Our next session is going to be, do you have it, Sophia?
Yeah, I'm working on trying to share it. Give me 1 second here, but I will put it also in the email that we send out.
Okay, great. We're going to do a panel for you all with some organizers. So as we're moving into this next administration, we want to have organizers tell all on what they need. How do we build and block in these times that we've been in before, and learn from their experiences. And as for us in philanthropy, how do we make sure that we're resourcing them and listening to them? So we'll have organizers who are working on transgender issues, climate justice, reproductive justice, and immigration. All right, 3 minutes to spare. I almost never end early, so I will give you 3 minutes back in your day. And thank you all for being part of this conversation and for all the work that you're doing. whether activists, CLT members, donors, you all are the people who are making sure that we are living into the world that we want to see for ourselves. So thanks for joining us today. And thank you to our presenters. Let's hear it for Sherilyn and Minnie. All right. Take care, everybody.